On July 10th, 1942, a lieutenant flying a patrol aircraft over Akutan Island in Alaska spotted something extraordinary through his cockpit window. There, sitting upside down in the mud of this remote tundra wilderness, lay a Japanese Zero fighter, intact and pristine. For over a year, these sleek machines had haunted American pilots' nightmares. In ready rooms across the Pacific, the talk was always the same. The Zero couldn't be beaten. 12 Allied fighters shot down for every Japanese loss. Impossible turning radius, climbing ability that seemed to defy the laws of nature. The legend had taken on a life of its own, perfect Japanese engineering wrapped in lightweight aluminum. An invincible flying machine, or so everyone believed. But when Navy mechanics finally opened up that captured aircraft at North Island 2 months later, Chief Bob Mike's face went pale. Behind the pilot's seat, no armor plating, the fuel tanks weren't self-sealing. There was no bulletproof glass protecting the cockpit, just bare aluminum and desperate hope. The Zero weighed 3,700 pounds, a full 1,500 pounds lighter than an American Wildcat. What pilots had feared as supernatural engineering turned out to be something far more terrifying. A flying death trap held together by myth and prayer. The aircraft that terrorized the Pacific was killing its own pilots faster than any enemy bullet ever could. The story of how this machine came to rest in that Alaskan bog begins earlier, on the morning of June 4th, 1942, when grey dawn broke over Dutch Harbor. A young Japanese pilot named Tate Koga prepared his aircraft on the flight deck of the carrier Ryujo. At just 19 years old, Koga had been training for this moment since joining the Imperial Navy. This was his first combat mission, and he would fly against American forces on their own territory. His Mitsubishi Zero, designation A6M0, felt responsive beneath his hands as he worked through his pre-flight checks. The Nakajima Sakai radial engine hummed with mechanical precision as he taxied down the flight deck. Koga flew as wingman in a tight three-plane formation, the distinctive elliptical wings gleaming as they turned toward the American naval base. During the pre-dawn briefing, his section leader, a veteran with over 200 combat hours, had outlined the tactical situation. American pilots would likely scramble their clumsy Curtiss P-40s or send up obsolete patrol bombers. Nothing the Americans could field would match the Zero's superior maneuverability. Standard tactics called for engaging in turning combat, where Japanese training and aircraft performance would prove decisive. The plan seemed flawless. As they approached, the harbor emerged through broken clouds exactly as intelligence photographs had predicted. Fuel storage tanks stretched across the landscape, aircraft hangars stood in neat rows. A seaplane tender was moored at the main pier. Koga's section dove first, their 7.7mm machine guns hammering at the hangars while they saved their twin 20mm cannons for more valuable targets. Black smoke billowed from the fuel dumps as incendiary rounds found their marks. On the second pass, Koga spotted a PBY Catalina patrol bomber attempting to take off from the water. The twin-engine flying boat was exactly the kind of target Japanese pilots trained to destroy. Slow, unarmored, defenseless, Koga lined up his attack, and the Zero responded with fluid grace. His cannons tore into the Catalina's port engine, sending metal fragments spinning into the frigid water. The American aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant Commander James Russell with a crew of 7, never had a chance. The patrol bomber's single defensive machine gun couldn't track the attacking Zeros fast enough. Within 30 seconds, the Catalina was burning and sinking into Makushin Bay. Koga felt the satisfaction of a perfect kill as he pulled up from his attack run. His section had performed exactly as trained, precise, coordinated, lethal. The American defenders offered only scattered anti-aircraft fire that posed no real threat to the nimble Japanese fighters. This was the Zero's domain: superior training, superior tactics, superior aircraft. But as Koga climbed away from the harbor, a single American machine gunner changed everything. Petty Officer Albert Mitchell manned a .50 caliber Browning on the roof of a damaged hangar. He fired a long burst at the departing Zeros. Most rounds missed, but one bullet, just 0.5 of an inch of hardened steel, traveled at 2,800 feet per second and found its mark. The round punched through the Zero's paper-thin aluminum skin and severed the oil return line to Koga's engine. From outside the aircraft, the damage was completely invisible. No dramatic explosion, no immediate loss of power. The engine continued running normally as Koga rejoined his formation for the flight back to Ryujo. Oil pressure stayed steady. Engine temperature remained within normal limits. Everything seemed fine. 20 minutes into the return flight, the severed line finally emptied the engine's lubrication system. Koga's first warning came when the cylinder head temperature gauge began climbing rapidly toward the red zone. The engine started running rough, missing on one or more cylinders as internal components began seizing. Within minutes, the Nakajima was destroying itself from the inside. Koga radioed his section leader, reporting mechanical problems and requesting permission for an emergency landing. The nearest Japanese territory lay 300 miles southeast, but several islands below showed flat terrain suitable for a dead-stick landing. His wingmen moved immediately into escort positions, ready to provide cover if Koga went down. The engine seized completely 40 miles from Dutch Harbor. Suddenly, the cockpit fell silent, except for the whistle of wind over the Zero's wings. Koga had trained for this scenario, but never over hostile territory with no possibility of rescue. He began scanning the islands below for suitable landing sites, searching for flat ground long enough to accommodate a wheels-up landing. Akuton Island appeared ahead, a desolate stretch of tundra and volcanic rock, inhabited only by foxes and seabirds. Koga spotted what looked like flat ground near a shallow inlet on the island's north coast. The terrain appeared soft, possibly boggy, which might cushion his landing. He had no other choice. The Zero touched down at 90 miles per hour, much faster than normal, but still within the aircraft's structural limits. The soft tundra grabbed the landing gear immediately, flipping the fighter upside down in a shower of mud and grass. The impact knocked Koga unconscious. His neck snapped against the instrument panel. The lightweight construction that made his aircraft so maneuverable also made it fragile. Koga's wingmen circled the crash site, looking for any sign of movement from their inverted aircraft. Standard Japanese procedure required them to strafe any Zero that fell into enemy hands, ensuring its advanced technology could never be captured. Both pilots carried incendiary ammunition specifically for this purpose. But seeing no movement from Koga's cockpit, they faced an agonizing decision. Their friend might still be alive, trapped in the wreckage. They couldn't bring themselves to fire on their wingman. The two Zeros turned southeast toward home, leaving behind the most valuable intelligence prize of the Pacific War sitting upside down in an Alaskan bog. 5 weeks passed. Lieutenant William Thies was flying a routine PBY patrol on July 10, 1942, when thick fog rolled off the Bering Sea like a grey blanket and disoriented him. When the weather finally cleared, he found himself over an island he didn't immediately recognize. He circled while getting his bearings from coastal landmarks. That's when he saw it. The distinctive silhouette of a Japanese fighter sitting upside down in the tundra, half a mile inland from a shallow inlet. Thies had studied enemy aircraft recognition charts obsessively since Pearl Harbor. Those elliptical wings and greenhouse canopy were unmistakably a Mitsubishi Zero. But this one wasn't burning or shattered like every other Japanese aircraft he'd encountered. The fuselage appeared intact. The wings still attached. The propeller buried in soft earth but not destroyed. Thies immediately radioed Dutch Harbor with coordinates and a detailed description. Within hours, a PBY loaded with intelligence officers and recovery equipment was airborne, followed by a destroyer task force. The Navy had captured Japanese aircraft before, but never a Zero in flyable condition. Most had been shot down over water or crashed into terrain that left little worth examining. The recovery operation took 3 weeks to organize properly. Chief Petty Officer William Laird, a maintenance specialist with 15 years of experience, supervised the delicate process of extracting the aircraft and assessing its condition. The soft Alaskan tundra had cushioned the impact, leaving the airframe structurally sound despite the inverted landing. Koga's body was removed and buried with military honors. American forces respected enemy airmen who had died fighting. Laird's preliminary examination revealed details that immediately caught naval intelligence's attention. The Zero's construction was unlike anything American engineers had seen. Where a Grumman Wildcat used thick aluminum sheeting and heavy internal bracing, the Japanese fighter employed paper-thin metal held together by thousands of flush rivets. The entire aircraft felt delicate, almost fragile, compared to American fighters built like flying tanks. Creating the Zero for shipment required custom wooden boxes designed to accommodate the 40-foot wingspan and 29-foot fuselage without damaging the control surfaces. Chief Machinist's mate, Robert Mikesh, supervised the construction of what he later called the most awkward cargo in naval history. Every component had to be padded and secured against the constant rolling motion of a destroyer crossing the North Pacific. The Zero arrived at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego on August 15, 1942. Mikesh, hand-picked to lead the restoration team, supervised the uncrating with the reverence of an archaeologist opening an ancient tomb. This was the enemy's most feared weapon, the aircraft that had shot down Allied fighters at 12-to-1 ratios across the Pacific. American pilots spoke of the Zero in whispers, describing supernatural maneuverability and climb rates that seemed to defy physics itself. Mikesh's first task was restoring the Nakajima Sakai radial engine to working condition. The 14-cylinder power plant had seized completely during Koga's emergency landing, but careful disassembly revealed most internal components remained undamaged. The oil starvation that killed the engine had actually preserved many parts by coating them with a protective film before they could overheat completely. Laboring through grueling 16-hour shifts under rigid security conditions, Mikesh's crew tackled one component after another. Damaged pistons came out, cylinders were carefully honed, and fresh bearings went into place throughout the entire engine assembly. As they worked, something remarkable became clear. Japanese metallurgical expertise was extraordinary. In some areas, it actually surpassed what American manufacturers were producing. The connecting rods told part of the story. These pieces had been forged from a specialized steel alloy that possessed an almost magical combination of strength and lightness. The engineers examining them couldn't help but be impressed. The cylinder heads showed similarly sophisticated thinking. Their cooling fins had been designed with precision to shed heat efficiently while keeping weight down, but nothing compared to what they discovered when Mikesh pulled away the engine cowling and started looking at the fuselage itself. What emerged was absolutely startling. The construction methods seemed almost crude by American standards. The Zero's legendary lightness wasn't the result of advanced technology at all. It came from a brutal philosophy: eliminate anything that wasn't absolutely necessary for flight. Nowhere on this aircraft could they find armor plating. The windscreen had no bulletproof glass. The fuel tanks refused to seal themselves when damaged. It was the fuel system that left American engineers shaking their heads in disbelief. The Zero carried 180 gallons of aviation gasoline in tanks so thin that a simple screwdriver could pierce them like paper. A Wildcat, by comparison, had self-sealing tanks lined with special rubber compounds. When a bullet punched through, the rubber would automatically seal the hole, preventing the catastrophic fuel fires that had killed thousands of Allied pilots. The Japanese had made a conscious decision. Range mattered more than keeping their pilots alive. They were betting their superior maneuverability would keep enemy bullets away. Control systems revealed the same pattern of thinking repeated throughout. The ailerons, elevators, and rudder all moved through simple cables and pulleys with no hydraulic assistance whatsoever. It saved weight, certainly, but it demanded incredible physical strength from the pilot, especially when pulling hard G-forces at high speed. American fighters were increasingly switching to hydraulic systems that let pilots maintain full authority over their aircraft, regardless of the punishment they endured. The trade-offs Japanese engineers had embraced were becoming more obvious with every component they examined. By September 15th, the restoration work was finally finished. When the Nakajima engine roared to life on the first try, settling into a smooth, powerful rhythm, it proved something important. Japanese engine manufacturing really was first-rate. Mikesh had cleverly installed American instruments right alongside the original Japanese gauges, making it possible to compare performance data side by side during the upcoming test flights. Everything was ready for the moment they'd all been waiting for. For the first time in the war, an American pilot would sit in the cockpit of the enemy's most feared fighter. The Navy selected Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders based on his reputation as their most analytical test pilot. Unlike the aggressive instincts that guided most fighter jocks, Sanders thought like an engineer. He studied charts obsessively, memorized procedures until he could recite them backward, and ran extensive ground checks before ever leaving solid ground. The Zero meant far more than just another aircraft to evaluate. It held the answer to a terrifying question. Why were so many American pilots dying in Pacific air combat? Sanders had spent weeks absorbing captured Japanese flight manuals that Navy intelligence had translated, learning emergency procedures and limitations that might keep him breathing if something went catastrophically wrong. When the Nakajima engine kicked over, its 14 cylinders settled into a steady rhythm that sounded remarkably familiar to any American pilot who'd flown comparable radial engines. Sanders went through his pre-flight routine with methodical care, noticing that the Japanese had laid out their instruments logically with clear markings. The fuel gauges registered the full amount, 180 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline. This was what gave the Zero its incredible range, but it also made the aircraft a flying fire hazard waiting to happen if enemy bullets found their mark. The takeoff surprised him with its ease. The Zero lifted away after barely 700 feet of ground roll, climbing at a rate that immediately caught his attention. At full throttle, the Nakajima produced over 900 horsepower while weighing 1,500 pounds less than equivalent American engines. That power-to-weight advantage explained everything about the Zero's legendary ability to climb. No Allied fighter in the Pacific could match it. Once he reached 5,000 feet, Sanders began his systematic appraisal. The controls felt wonderfully light and responsive, requiring barely a touch to roll into smooth turns and climbs. Japanese engineers had achieved something special: perfect control harmony. The aileron, elevator, and rudder forces were so precisely balanced that they created natural, intuitive handling. At 150 miles per hour, the aircraft seemed to anticipate his intentions before he even finished moving the stick, responding with graceful efficiency. Sanders pushed the throttle forward, bringing the speed up to 180. The Zero remained docile and eager, turning in either direction without dropping a wing or threatening to stall. He keyed the radio to the tower below. "This thing handles like a dream," he said. "No wonder they've been beating us." Every doubt about Japanese engineering superiority seemed completely justified during those first 15 minutes in the air. But something shifted as Sanders continued accelerating through higher speeds. Small changes began making themselves known. As he pushed toward 200 and then 230 miles per hour, the stick required noticeably more pressure to execute maneuvers that had been effortless minutes before. Sanders recognized the change, but filed it away as normal aerodynamic effects that affected all aircraft as speed climbed. The real eye-opener came when he attempted a hard right turn at 220 knots indicated. He pulled the stick back and shoved it right, expecting the instantaneous response that had seemed so natural at lower speeds. Instead, the ailerons felt locked up. The Zero began turning, yes, but slowly and sluggishly. Like some clumsy transport plane rather than an agile fighter. The roll rate had dropped dramatically. A left turn at the same speed produced similar disappointing results. He pushed the throttle forward again, accelerating to 240 knots, and tried another right turn. The ailerons had become nearly immovable. The Zero wanted nothing more than to keep flying straight, resisting every attempt to force it into aggressive maneuvering. This discovery would reshape everything. All those American pilots had been trying to dogfight with Zeros at slow speeds where the Japanese aircraft owned every advantage. But once speeds climbed above 200 knots, speeds that American fighters could maintain easily, the Zero transformed into something almost helpless. Its lightweight construction and manual control system, designed brilliantly for combat between 150 and 180 mph, became fatal weaknesses when forced to operate at higher velocities. A series of diving tests revealed even more critical problems. The Zero's maximum safe diving speed stopped at 415 mph, where control flutter would set in. That was a full 100 mph slower than a Wildcat could dive safely. Any American pilot who stayed above 250 mph could control how the fight developed. The Zero pilot would be forced to accept battle under terrible disadvantages or try to escape. But escaping meant slowing down, which only made everything worse. Negative G maneuvers produced a discovery that was almost unbelievable. When Sanders pushed the nose down in a sudden diving attack, the Nakajima engine simply died. The float-type carburetor designed for steady flight conditions couldn't handle the sudden interruption in fuel supply. The engine would restart once he leveled off, but those few seconds of silence could be fatal if an enemy was on his tail. American aircraft used pressure carburetors or fuel injection that kept power flowing through any maneuver a pilot could throw at them. High-altitude testing showed yet another weakness. Above 20,000 feet, the Nakajima's power deteriorated rapidly because it relied on a single-stage supercharger. American fighters like the Corsair and the upcoming Hellcat had two-stage superchargers that maintained power at much higher altitudes. Any fight above 15,000 feet would belong to the Americans. After 2 hours of intense flying, Sanders brought the Zero back down. His understanding of the aircraft had transformed completely. The fighter that seemed invincible during those opening moments was actually an elaborate collection of compromises. Japanese designers had pushed every component to its maximum capability within specific parameters: low altitude, moderate speeds, and turning combat. Beyond those carefully defined boundaries, the Zero became increasingly vulnerable. Commander Frederick Trapnell landed at North Island 3 days later to conduct comparative tests. As the Navy's most respected test pilot, Trapnell had flown every American fighter in service and knew their strengths intimately. His assignment was to fly the same maneuvers in the Zero and various American fighters side by side, providing direct performance comparisons that would guide how the Navy fought from that point forward. Trapnell's first flight in the Zero confirmed Sanders' observations and uncovered additional problems. The aircraft's armament, while adequate for strafing unprotected targets, was marginal against the heavily armored American fighters. The twin 20mm cannons carried only 60 rounds per gun, enough for roughly 7 seconds of sustained fire. After that ammunition ran out, the pilot was left with two 7.7mm machine guns that lacked the penetration to get through the armor that shielded American pilots. The psychological impact of these findings was staggering. For 10 months, American pilots had approached every Zero encounter, convinced they were flying obsolete aircraft against technologically superior enemies. The truth was almost the opposite. American fighters carried better weapons, better protection, and greater speed where air combat actually occurred. The tactical solution had been waiting the whole time: stay fast, refuse to turn fight, and use superior diving capability to control how engagements developed. On October 15, 1942, Trapnell prepared for the most revealing test yet. Naval intelligence had scrounged up captured Japanese ammunition from Pacific battlefields, providing an opportunity to test the Zero's weapons using actual ordnance the Japanese had carried. The armament evaluation would complete the picture that Sanders had started with his flight testing. Trapnell loaded the twin 20mm Type 99 cannons with 60 rounds per gun, the standard load Japanese pilots carried into combat. The ammunition mix included high-explosive rounds and armor-piercing shells designed to destroy both aircraft and ground targets. Each cannon cycled at 500 rounds per minute, which meant a pilot had exactly 7.2 seconds of firing time before the magazines ran empty. At the Navy's gunnery range off Point Loma, target drones stood in for enemy aircraft. Trapnell set up the test following the standard Japanese attack profile: a high-speed diving pass from above and behind. The Type 99 cannons unleashed their fire with startling precision, their high-velocity shells tearing through the fabric target with ease. Yet Trapnell recognized a critical vulnerability. Those cannons required precious minutes between rounds, and in the chaos of actual combat, pilots wouldn't get a second opportunity if that first volley missed its mark. What proved far more revealing, however, was how these weapons stacked up against what American fighters carried. A Grumman Wildcat bristled with 650 caliber Browning machine guns. Together, they could pump out 1,040 rounds before running dry, enough for just 15 seconds of continuous fire. But what those 15 seconds delivered was nothing short of devastating. Each gun sprayed 240 rounds per minute, creating a cone of fire so dense it could shred enemy aircraft or bounce between multiple targets with ease. Those superior Japanese cannon shells meant almost nothing if a pilot couldn't land his first burst on target. Trapnell's investigation into the Zero's captured components exposed something far more troubling than anything else he'd discovered. He was determined to understand the aircraft's most dangerous vulnerability. He ordered technicians to build mock-ups of the Zero's fuel system using authentic Japanese tanks and piping, then subjected them to what American .50 caliber rounds would actually do. The results were absolutely catastrophic. The unprotected tanks burst open violently, releasing 180 gallons of high-octane gasoline that flooded through the aircraft's fuselage. What the Americans had done differently became immediately obvious. Trapnell examined a Wildcat self-sealing tanks that had endured genuine combat damage and survived to tell the tale. The rubber compounds inside had expanded the moment fuel touched them, sealing the holes that would have turned an unprotected aircraft into an inferno. The Japanese had made a brutal calculation, sacrificed this life-saving system to shed roughly 300 pounds, trading pilot survival for the ability to fly farther. Structural analysis revealed even starker realities about who got protected in combat. American fighters featured armor plating positioned directly behind the pilot's seat, bulletproof glass protecting the windscreen, and reinforced cockpit frames engineered to endure battle damage. The Zero offered the pilot absolutely nothing. A single .50 caliber round punching through the pilot's compartment would almost certainly be fatal, while the identical shot striking an American fighter might cause nothing more than a minor wound. Trapnell arranged live fire tests. He positioned .50 caliber machine guns against actual Zero structural components and opened fire. The lightweight aluminum that gave the aircraft its astonishing agility also rendered it shockingly vulnerable to battle damage. What appeared to be solid panels were actually paper-thin, stripped down to save every possible ounce of weight. A 2-second burst from a Wildcat's guns, roughly 40 rounds, could punch through the Zero's frame like a can opener, shredding vital control systems and igniting the defenseless fuel supply in a spreading inferno. The full weight of these findings was staggering. American pilots hadn't been losing air battles because they flew worse aircraft. They'd been losing because they were flying superior aircraft in exactly the wrong way. The Zero's legend of invincibility had emerged from battles where American pilots had surrendered every conceivable advantage. Low-speed turning combat at moderate altitudes, precisely where the Zero's lightweight airframe and powerful engine seemed to perform miracles. Trapnell's flight tests comparing the Zero against various American fighters proved the point beyond any doubt. When he took the Zero against a Wildcat in simulated dogfights, the Japanese aircraft dominated completely as long as speeds stayed below 200 knots. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver the heavier American fighter with almost embarrassing ease. Any pilot foolish enough to accept a turning fight at those speeds was essentially committing suicide. But the moment Trapnell pushed speeds above 250 knots, everything reversed dramatically. The Zero's controls began to feel sluggish and unresponsive, while the Wildcat maintained full authority. The American fighter could dive away whenever it chose, forcing the Zero pilot to either accept a disadvantageous position or pursue at speeds where the aircraft became dangerously uncontrollable. The tests with newer American fighters proved the point even more decisively. The Vought F-4U Corsair, just beginning to arrive with Marine squadrons, could outrun the Zero at any altitude while packing superior firepower and cockpit protection. The incoming Grumman F-6F Hellcat promised advantages that were almost unfair. A top speed 50 miles per hour, faster than the Zero combined with armor plating that made it nearly immune to the Japanese fighters' lighter weapons. Trapnell's final report to the Bureau of Aeronautics contained recommendations that would fundamentally reshape American fighter tactics. The central truth was simple yet revolutionary. American pilots must never attempt to dogfight a Zero below 200 knots, where every advantage belonged to the enemy. Above 250 knots, however, the Zero pilot became helpless, unable to maneuver effectively or maintain pursuit of faster American fighters. The tactical manual that emerged from these tests emphasized boom and zoom attacks, high-speed diving passes designed to exploit American fighters' superior velocity and structural strength. American pilots received clear instructions. Use your aircraft's advantages without hesitation. Control engagement geometry through superior diving speed. Concentrate heavier armament for maximum damage during brief firing windows. Rely on better protection to survive hits that would destroy a Zero. The manual also pinpointed the Zero's unprotected fuel system as the primary target. Pilots trained to aim for the wing roots and fuselage center section, where concentrated .50 caliber fire would rupture fuel tanks and detonate the aircraft's entire gasoline supply. The same lightweight construction that made the Zero so maneuverable also made it a flying bomb, destroyable by damage that would barely slow an American fighter. These discoveries began reaching Pacific squadrons in November 1942, initially through unofficial channels as test pilots shared their findings with operational commanders. The psychological shift was immediate and profound. Pilots who had dreaded Zero encounters suddenly understood they possessed decisive advantages if they knew how to use them. The aircraft they'd considered inferior was actually superior in every category that mattered for high-speed combat. The terrible irony became clear when Trapnell's classified report reached Admiral John Towers at the Bureau of Aeronautics in late October 1942. For 10 months, American pilots had been dying because they fought exactly wrong against Zero fighters. Every tactical manual, every training program, every conventional wisdom had stressed the importance of turning combat and close-range dogfighting. Those were precisely the conditions where Japanese aircraft held overwhelming advantages. Lieutenant Commander John Smith, operations officer for VMF 223 on Guadalcanal, received one of the first tactical summaries drawn from the Zero tests. Reading the document in his sweltering tent beside Henderson Field, Smith felt rage and revelation in equal measure. His squadron had lost 12 pilots the previous month, most shot down while trying to outturn Zeros in traditional fighter fashion. The solution had been available all along, obscured only by assumptions about air combat inherited from World War I. The new tactical doctrine flipped everything upside down. American pilots were told to abandon every instinct that their training had drilled into them. Rather than seeking turning engagements, they should avoid them completely. Rather than matching enemy maneuverability, they should exploit superior speed and firepower. Rather than dogfighting, they should execute high-speed diving attacks that gave Zero pilots no chance to respond. Major John Lucian Smith of VMF 2223 implemented the new tactics immediately, pushing past resistance from pilots who'd survived months of combat using traditional methods. The psychological shift was difficult. It seemed like cowardice to dive away from an enemy rather than fighting to the finish. But Smith demanded his pilots practice boom and zoom attacks relentlessly, building muscle memory that would override their fundamental fighter pilot instincts. The first real test arrived on November 15th when a formation of 18 Zeros approached Henderson Field during a morning bomber escort mission. Smith led 8 Wildcats in a diving attack from 22,000 feet, leveraging superior altitude and speed for tactical surprise. Instead of turning to engage the Zeros in prolonged dogfighting, the American pilots made one high-speed pass, squeezed their triggers, and dove away before Japanese pilots could react. 3 Zeros erupted in flames during that 30-second engagement. Smith's formation suffered no losses and was climbing back to altitude for another attack within 5 minutes. The psychological impact rippled across both sides immediately. American pilots discovered they could inflict casualties without accepting the traditional risks of turning combat. Japanese pilots found themselves unable to force the kind of engagement where their training and aircraft performance mattered. The tactical revolution spread rapidly through Marine and Navy squadrons flying from Henderson Field. By December 1942, kill ratios had begun reversing dramatically. VMF 121 achieved a 5-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese fighters during a 2-week stretch, using tactics drawn directly from the Akutan Zero tests. Marine pilots who'd counted themselves fortunate to survive Zero encounters now approached Japanese formations with genuine confidence. Intelligence from Trapnell's testing also shaped American aircraft design in fundamental ways. Grumman engineers developing the F-6F Hellcat incorporated specific features designed to exploit the Zero's weaknesses that Trapnell had exposed. The Hellcat's engine was optimized for high-altitude performance, where the Zero suffered power losses. Its structure was built to withstand the high-speed diving attacks that would tear apart Japanese fighters. Most crucially, its armament was concentrated in the wings to deliver maximum firepower during brief firing opportunities. When the Hellcat entered combat in August 1943, it produced results that seemed impossible just 1 year earlier. VF-5, flying from the carrier Yorktown, shot down 37 Japanese aircraft in 3 days, while losing only 1 pilot. The 12-to-1 kill ratio that had favored Japanese fighters was now reversed in American favor by an even larger margin. Captain David McCampbell, commanding VF-15 aboard the Essex, used Zero intelligence to refine attack techniques that maximized the Hellcat's advantages. His pilots were trained to identify the vulnerable areas Trapnell's tests had mapped precisely: the unprotected fuel tanks in the wing roots, the paper-thin aluminum skin offering no protection against .50 caliber fire, and the pilot compartment completely lacking armor plating. The psychological transformation mattered as much as the tactical changes. American pilots who'd spent months fearing Zero encounters now sought them out aggressively. The mystique that had seemed to make Japanese fighters invincible evaporated once pilots understood the engineering compromises that created both strengths and fatal weaknesses. Knowledge replaced fear, and confidence replaced the defensive mindset that had killed so many Americans. By February 1943, Navy and Marine pilots flying Wildcats were achieving kill ratios of 5.9 to 1 against Japanese fighters. The improvement didn't stem from better aircraft. The Wildcat was identical to the one that had suffered terrible losses earlier, but from tactics based on scientific analysis rather than conventional wisdom. American pilots finally understood how to use their aircraft's inherent advantages against enemy weaknesses that reputation and mystique had concealed. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, discovered they couldn't force engagements where their training and aircraft design provided benefits. American formations refused to be drawn into turning combat, instead using superior diving speed to control when and how battles would be fought. Zero pilots found their legendary maneuverability worthless if enemy fighters could dictate engagement conditions from positions of tactical advantage. The strategic implications extended far beyond individual air battles. Japanese naval aviation had been constructed around the Zero's performance characteristics, with carrier operations, pilot training, and tactical doctrine all optimized for an aircraft designed to achieve air superiority through superior maneuverability and range. When American pilots learned to neutralize those advantages, the entire Japanese naval aviation system became virtually obsolete overnight. The Akutan Zero, having fulfilled its purpose in revolutionizing American fighter tactics, was destroyed in a training accident at Salton Sea on February 20, 1945. But by then, its legacy was already written across every Pacific battlefield. The aircraft that had once terrorized Allied pilots had become the instrument of its own defeat, teaching American engineers and pilots exactly how to win the air war that would determine the Pacific conflict's outcome. Zero number 4593 had changed the course of World War II by proving that even legends have limits, and those limits can be measured, understood, and exploited by enemies willing to abandon mythology in favor of facts.